Today, January 22nd, is the fifth day of a Super GM chess tournament in Wannsee, Netherlands. We're going to analyze the game that was not only the most interesting in round 5, but was possibly the most interesting game of the whole tournament. The game featured the Grandmaster from Netherlands, Van Foreest, which I learned today is the correct pronunciation, although many call him Van Forest, and the player who has been a constant feature in my videos, Nazarbek Abdusador. Not only he is the sixth highest ranked player in the world currently, but he is in superb chess shape and plays great chess in this particular tournament. White starts with the move e4. Black answers with c6, which is a Caro-Kann defense. The most usual move here is d4, occupying the center for white. And counterplay for black is immediately d5, attacking white center. There are many moves here in this position for white. The most popular are knight c3 or e5, and that's what's played here, e5. Black plays bishop f5, developing the bishop before they play e6. White plays c4, again putting pressure on black center. Black goes e6, freeing up the diagonal for the black squared bishop. Knight c3, developing the knight. Bishop b4, pinning the knight to the king. Knight e2. Knight e2, not knight f3, because the idea eventually would be to put this knight on g3, where he would be attacking the bishop on f5. Black goes knight e7, preparing for the short castle. a3, attacking the bishop. Here in this position, most of the time, black takes on c3. That's the standard way to play this position, but black decided to move the bishop away on a5. And immediately, the Grandmaster from Netherlands attacks that bishop with an aggressive move b4. The bishop has to go back to the square c7. Knight g3, that was the plan, to attack the bishop on f5. It's protected, and it doesn't have to be defended, really. But Nazarbek plays back to g6. Computer shows this move as a mistake, but it's not really a big mistake. It's just another way to treat this position for black. h4. An idea of the move h4 is obviously that white wants to move the pawn forward and play h5. And this had to be protected by the counterplay with the move h5. Black decided to play h6, and immediately white goes h5, gaining the space on the queen side, on the king side of the board. The bishop goes back, it's under attack, so it goes back to h7. White continue with a nice move, queen g4. Very aggressive attacking move. The pawn on g7 is under attack, not protected. And the other beauty of this move is that the black cannot castle in this position, because if they castle, they allow the bishop to take h6 on h6 because of the spin. And not only the white wins the pawn, but also there is really not much they can do to protect themselves from a checkmate on g7. So the black plays kind of unusual move, but maybe the only one here, rook g8, protecting the pawn on g7, so they cannot castle short side anymore in this game, and they will have to castle long or leave the king in the middle. Neither option is great, and therefore white's position is very good at this point of the game. White plays bishop e2, standard developing move, preparing the short castle. D takes c4, bishop takes c4, exchange the pawns, knight went to d7, that's the only square available to this knight at this point, just developing the knight. White castle according to their initial plan, and black puts the knight on f5, putting it in the active position on f5, and the white again develops the bishop on e3. This bishop is not great because it's surrounded by the pawns of the same color, so therefore this knight on f5 is more active, and therefore it's not recommended to exchange the good knight for a bad bishop. So queen e7, black is preparing the long castle, and white plays b5, which seems like a preemptive aggressive move. Expecting the long castle, white immediately started attacking on the queen side. The reason this move is a mistake, because of the next move by the black, c5. c5 is a very good move, and what it achieves, it undermines white center on d4. And now if you take the pawn on c5, there is a simple combination here. Knight takes e3, f takes e3, knight takes e5, with the double attack on the bishop and the queen. The queen has to move away. Knight takes bishop on c4, queen takes knight, and the last move of this combination is bishop takes g3. And black has an extra piece and totally winning position. Therefore, after c5, white plays knight takes f5, liquidating this nice looking knight on f5. Black takes back with the bishop. The queen is under attack, and the queen goes to f3, attacking the pawn on b7. Black defends the pawn on b7 with the castle. So the king protects the pawn on b7. Now we can immediately see that the king on c8, the king on this side of the board, is not really protected that well, and white chances on attacking on the queen side are looking pretty dangerous. And here comes knight d5. Very unexpected move and very nice move. Now, you might think that what if black just takes the knight with the pawn? He takes d5. And here the idea was not taking the bishop on f5. That's not the plan, because black just takes the bishop on c4 and remained with an extra piece. The idea here was that the idea was bishop takes d5, and bishop takes d5, and what happens is that bishop on f5 is under attack, and if bishop goes away to, let's say, e6, here is bishop takes b7 check, king goes to the only square available, b8, and here is the move bishop a8. And it turns out that there is no real defense from checkmate on b7. And that was white's idea. Now Nodirbeck, playing black, obviously saw all this. He took the knight on d5. White took it with the bishop on d5. And now black makes probably the only or the best move, at least in this position, king b8. And king b8 protects from taking this pawn with a check. So now, let's say if white continues with the same plan as before to checkmate on b7, so they first take the pawn on b7, then the black just takes the pawn on d4, and let's say after bishop takes d4, black has knight takes e5, attacking the queen. In the other variation, in this position after d4, if the bishop just moves away, there is a move knight c5, attacking the bishop, and bishop a8 doesn't do anything in this position because the square on b7 is protected by the knight, and the queen cannot get there without being captured. So let's move back. King b8, and in this particular position, white basically starting to understand that their position is getting worse and worse, and they decided, well, let us take the bishop on f8, on f5. Knight takes e5 is a very nice counter move because now the black took the pawn and the bishop on d5 is under attack. White takes the knight with the pawn on de. Rook takes d5. Rooks take d5, pawn on e5 is under attack, and therefore white protects the pawn with the move f4. Black plays rook d8, doubling the rooks on the d file. White goes to e4 with the queen, which is a mistake because it puts the queen in front of the other queen, and this pawn on e5 is now pinned, and black immediately uses the opportunity to play f6, undermining this pawn on e5, and you cannot take on f6 because you lose the queen. Therefore, in this position, white decides that nothing we can really do in the middle of the board. We're losing this battle. Let's create some counter chances on the queen side. Let's attack the black king. But the attack is pretty slow. They go a4. Black takes the pawn on e5. a5. So white don't even care about losing more pawns on this side of the board. They just want to create some confusion, to create some counter chances, to make sure that black has to think in this position and make the water muddy. Black goes to e8, queen goes to e8, which is another beautiful move, attacking two pawns at the same time. Now here, just in case black couldn't take the pawn on f4 because they would lose the queen, so that just obviously those type of mistakes are not made on this level. So after queen e8, white goes b6. They sacrifice the pawn on b6 to open up files for the rooks in order to attack the black king. That's creating some counter chances, and I have to say hats off to Van Foreest for being able to put some pressure on the black position. After bishop takes b6, white finally takes the pawn on e5. Bishop c7. Now, just in case you were wondering why the rook cannot take the pawn right away, it can, but there is an unpleasant move, bishop f4, pinning the knight, the rook to the king, and black loses an exchange. So they would have to play bishop c7, and after those captures on e5, black's position is still winning, but the grandmaster from Uzbekistan decided to play a little safer and played this position, played bishop c7. White decided to protect the pawn with a move bishop f4, and at this particular position that's a mistake because black has a wonderful tactical idea starting with the move rook d4, attacking the queen. The queen moves away to e2, and here's the tactical shot. Rook takes f4. Great move. And in this particular position, so what happens is that after rook takes f4, which happened in the game, queen takes e5, and both rooks are under attack, and you cannot protect both. And if you play... actually, a lot of interesting things happening right at this moment of the game. It's like a critical moment of the game, because after queen e5, white had two choices. One choice was to move the queen to a2, and the black cannot take the rook on f4 because there is a checkmate on a8. The other move that white could make here with the same idea was rook from f4 to a4. And now you cannot take the queen because there is also a checkmate on a8. So in the game, one forest, move the queen to a2, and we'll see what happened next. But a very interesting variation would happen if rook goes to a4. And I'm assuming that Nazarbek had to see all this ahead of time because he wouldn't go in this position, because the next continuation, the next variation is actually forced, but black had to make very, very precise moves. Otherwise, they would lose this position. So the combination, the variation starts with the check on h2, queen h2 check. King goes to f1, another check from h1, king goes to f2, and in this position, rook f8 check, king e3, rook e8, king d3. And that's another interesting position because, again, you cannot take the queen on e2 because there is a checkmate. Therefore, after king d3, there is only one move that wins this position. Otherwise, white wins, which is very interesting because the rook is under attack and the checkmate is the threat. So there is only one move that saves black and actually kills white. And that move is c4. That's the most important move that Notterbeck had to see way ahead of time in order to go to this position. And now if king takes c4, queen h4 check, let's say king moves away to c3, another check on f6, king c4, and queen f7 check, king c3, and here bishop a5. And that move wins the game, because on rook takes a5, now you can take the queen and there is no checkmate. So that was a very interesting variation that black had to see ahead of time, otherwise they wouldn't go into this complicated position. And again, everything was starting with the potential move rook a4. But instead, the Netherlands Grandmaster played queen a2 with the same idea that you cannot take the rook because there is a checkmate on a8. And instead, so after queen a2, black played the best move in the position, queen e3 check. Queen e3 check, rook f2, rook went back, so protected, the rook was protected and the king is protected. And in this position, another beautiful move, bishop g3. After bishop g3, attacking the pinned rook, queen a8 check, king c7, and the king started to travel the whole board, going to the middle of the board, despite the fact that white has all the heavy pieces still present in the game, the rooks, two rooks, and the queen. And normally you would not want your king start traveling in this particular position, but in this case it all works out for black. Queen a5 check, b6, queen a7 check, king goes to c6, another check, b5 protecting the king, queen a6 check, and you might think that there could be some perpetual check opportunities for white, but instead black goes again to the middle of the board, not scared of anything, to d5, another check from b7, king goes to c4, queen goes to f7 with the check, and rook d5. And in this particular position, we can see that white ran out of checks. And there are no more checks in this position. The square c1 is protected by the queen. The rook on f2 cannot move because it's pinned. And the queen on f7 is out of the game and doesn't have any checks. Rook a2. And black just takes the rook on f2, moves the queen to d4, and after king h2 and another check, king goes very calmly to the square of b4, not afraid of anything, rook f1, and rook d2, and white resigned because they're without two pawns, and those two pawns are connected, and eventually one of them will become a queen. And this game would be easily won by black. So it was a beautiful, masterful performance by Nodirbek Abdusadorov, who is really in a top shape right now and plays some beautiful chess. And he became the leader of the tournament. The other game that I wanted to mention, and I don't want to analyze the whole game there, but just want to show you the end of the game between Vladimir Fedoseev, a Russian grandmaster who represents Slovenia on this tournament, and the best American grandmaster Fabiano Caruana, who is the highest rated player in this tournament with the rating of 2803 and one of the favorites of the tournament, at least before the tournament. But unfortunately for him and his fans, he is not playing his best chess in this tournament and only had 2.5 points out of 4. And understanding that his position in the standings is not so great, he wanted to play for the win in this end game for black. And unfortunately for him, trying to play for a win in a totally equal position sometimes works against you. So he moved the bishop to h3 with very logical idea to put the bishop on g2 and starting taking white pawns on f3 and e4. And after bishop h3, white moved the knight back to b3, check from a4, king goes to c2, and here bishop takes g2. And what happens that this move is a mistake, and the reason it's a mistake and something that probably Caruana missed in his calculations, that after white plays e5, which is the best move in this position, the threat is taking the pawn on f6 and queening the pawn. So you have to take the pawn. White takes back on e5, and in this particular position you cannot take the pawn on f3, which was probably originally the plan, because here is the fork. The knight forks the king and the bishop, and white wins a piece and easily wins the game. So after Caruana saw all this, he couldn't take the pawn on f3. He played b4, knight d4 check, king goes to c5, and in this position white goes e6, which is a standard pawn move when it's closer to the 8th rank. Now you cannot take the knight on d4 because e7, and the next move white gets a new queen and wins the game. So therefore the king has to go back to d6 to protect the square e7 from the movement of the pawn. White exchanges the pawns on b4, and another great tactical shot. Bishop takes d5. You cannot take the bishop on d5 because e7 again and the queen next move. So after this sacrifice, white's position is totally winning. There were still a lot of moves made in this game. Bishop f1, bishop b3, knight c5. I'll do them quickly because they're not as important right now. After a series of moves, after e7, again, next move is the queen. So bishop d3 check, king d2, bishop b5, protecting the square e8 from queening the pawn. And after a series of moves, black resigned because white has an extra pawn, and their king, which is the most important thing, is much closer to black pawns, and eventually it will capture them, and one of the white pawns will become a queen. So in this particular position, Fabiano Caruana resigned, and now he only has 2.5 points out of 5, which is a very disappointing start of the tournament for him. Let's take a look at the standings. There are two leaders of the tournament, Nodirbek Abdusadorov from Uzbekistan with 4 points out of 5, Pragnananda Ramesh Babu from India with the same 4 points out of 5. Under the third and fourth places are Gukesh Demarajev, the current world champion from India, and Vladimir Fedoseev, representing Slovenia, 3.5 points out of 5. Next round, the sixth round, would be in 2 days, on January 24th, and the featured game, the most interesting game, hopefully, would be between two leaders, Nodirbek Abdusadorov and Gukesh Damaraj. Until then, thank you for watching.